My name is Cassidy Lark Monroe, 31 years old. I still remember the way their faces drained of color, my dad's jaw tightening, my mom's fingers freezing in mid-smile the moment the judge let out that soft, surprised laugh after opening the letter I had handed him. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was the kind of sound a man makes when the truth on the page is so different from the story he has been sold that his body reacts before his brain catches up. He leaned forward slightly, eyes scanning faster, then glanced over his glasses at my parents. "Well," he murmured, almost conversationally, "this is interesting." The words settled over the courtroom like dust after a building collapses. In that moment, something hot and sharp lit up in my chest. Vindication. Not the cheap kind you get from being petty online, but the deep, bone-level kind that makes every sleepless night, every doubt, every lonely drive down Highway 1 suddenly feel like it had a purpose. Beside me, my attorney stayed perfectly still. Across the aisle, my father's confidence flickered, just for a second, like a bad light bulb. My mother's hand tightened on her handbag until her knuckles went white. They had walked into this room certain that I was the problem. The letter in the judge's hand said otherwise. But that moment, that quiet laugh, was just the crest of the wave. To understand why it hit so hard, you'd have to go back to where it started, with a phone call I never wanted to answer, and a woman whose absence rearranged the entire map of my life. 3 months before the hearing, I stepped off a transport plane with sand still clinging to my boots and deployment weight in my shoulders, ready for the familiar crash of humidity in Florida and the small comfort of being home soil again. I was exhausted in the specific way only the military can make you, sleep-deprived, over-caffeinated, and held together by routine and muscle memory. I had a duffel bag on my back and my logistics officer brain already making lists before I even grabbed my luggage. I expected to call my grandmother that night and hear her laugh in my ear, that bright, steady sound that always made the world feel less chaotic. Instead, my phone rang first. When I saw my mother's name, something in my stomach went cold. Her voice was clipped, brittle in a way that sounded rehearsed. "Your grandmother, Rosalind, passed away last week," she said. No preamble, no softening, just a statement dropped like a weight. The world narrowed to the sound of her voice, and the echo of the word passed. For a heartbeat, I forgot how to breathe. My grandmother was the woman who raised me when my parents decided they were too busy to be bothered, the woman who made sure my shoes fit and my homework was checked, and there was someone in the bleachers at every award ceremony, even if she had to leave work early to make it. She was the one constant in a life built around deployments, duty stations, and orders that could change with a single email. I asked the questions you ask on autopilot. When did it happen? What about the funeral? What do you need me to do? My father's voice came onto the line, flat and impatient, as if he were wrapping up a business call. "We're handling everything," he said. "There's no need for you to get involved." My mother added, "You're always busy with your Navy life anyway. It's better this way." A part of me recognized those words as a warning. Another part, numb with fresh grief and jet lag, let them slide past. I told myself they were just stressed. I told myself they were grieving in their own way. I told myself a lot of things that day to keep from acknowledging the raw, familiar ache of being kept at arm's length by the people who were supposed to pull me close. I spent the next week in the Florida Keys moving through the world like a ghost tethered to memories. I drove my grandmother's old routes, to the white steepled church on the corner where she volunteered at every fundraiser, to the tiny bakery with the chipped green counter where she swore they made the best key lime pie in the state, to the dock behind her house where she'd sit every evening with sweet tea, watching the sky bleed oranges and pinks into the water. Shop owners hugged me. Church friends cried with me. Old Navy veterans who rented her cottages year after year clapped me on the shoulder and called her one of the good ones. Their stories stitched together a picture of her that I already knew, but clung to anyway. It helped. It grounded me. It reminded me that she hadn't just been mine. She had belonged to an entire little universe of people. And threaded through all of it, like a quiet drumbeat, were the cottages. 7 small vacation homes scattered along the Keys, painted in pastel blues, greens, and yellows, with tin roofs that sang in the rain and hammocks swaying lazily out front. They weren't glamorous resorts. They were lived-in, loved spaces full of mismatched mugs, fading quilts, and the faint scent of sunscreen and old paperbacks. I had grown up sweeping those porches, trimming hedges, repainting shutters in the June heat until my neck burned and my hands ached. My grandmother would hand me a glass of iced tea, nod at the work we'd done, and say, "These houses will take care of you someday, sweetheart. You just have to take care of them first." It wasn't about profit, it was about stewardship. A few days after I got back, when the logistics of grief finally slowed enough for me to think, I drove to my parents' house expecting something. A conversation. A plan. Maybe even a shared moment of loss. Instead, I found them seated at the dining table as if they'd been waiting for a meeting, a neat stack of folders between them. The room smelled like lemon cleaner and tension. My father cleared his throat in that way he did when he was about to announce a decision, not invite a discussion. "We've decided to assume full ownership of the properties," he said. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. "Full ownership?" I repeated. My voice sounded too calm to belong to the chaos in my chest. "Grandma always told me—" "She told you nothing," my mother cut in sharply. "You were a child." Her eyes flicked to my uniform, like it was an inconvenience she had to ignore. "But there's a will," I said quietly. My grandmother had mentioned it more than once, in that matter-of-fact way she had about paperwork and planning. She said, "There is no will," my father said, each word clipped. "Legally, the properties transfer to us. That's how it works. And frankly, after everything we've done for those places, we deserve them." I almost laughed then. My parents had never spent a summer scraping old paint off shutters or fixing leaky pipes at midnight. They hadn't patched roofs after storms or hand-delivered rent reminders with a plate of cookies so tenants wouldn't feel embarrassed. That had been Grandma. That had been me. But I swallowed the laugh because Navy training teaches you that anger clouds judgment, and I needed to see clearly. "Can I at least see the paperwork?" I asked. My mother stood, swift and rigid, gathering the folders with movements that felt rehearsed. "There's nothing for you to read," she said. "You should be grateful we're not asking you to reimburse us for the funeral." That line landed sharper than they probably intended. Grateful. As if being allowed to stand at the edge of my own grandmother's legacy was a favor. I walked out of that house with a pit in my stomach that felt a lot like betrayal wrapped in plausible deniability. Something was wrong. Not just emotionally, but structurally. My grandmother was a planner, a list maker, the kind of woman who labeled the back of every photograph with the date and the names of everyone in it. She did not leave things to chance. She did not forget to formalize something as important as the cottages. A week later, I visited the cottages again, more as a granddaughter seeking comfort than as someone preparing for a fight. The air was thick with salt and heat, the sky so bright it made the pastel paint on the houses almost glow. As I walked the gravel path between units, one of the long-term tenants, a quiet woman in her 60s, who had rented there for nearly a decade, stepped off her porch and approached me. Her hands shook just enough to notice as she pressed a plain envelope into my palm. "She told me to give you this," the woman whispered. "Said it was important in case—" Her voice trailed off. She didn't need to finish. Inside, in my grandmother's unmistakable looping handwriting, was a single line. "If anything ever happens to me, look in the safe. You'll know what to do." I stared at the words until they blurred. A safe I'd never heard of. A message she'd never mentioned. It felt, irrationally, like she had reached out from beyond the grave and tapped me on the shoulder. After some digging and one very careful conversation with her bank, I found it. A safe deposit box under her name. The metal door felt heavier than it should have when I pulled it open. Inside were binders of property records, ledgers, deposit slips, tenant agreements, every detail of the cottages' lives laid out in ink and numbers. And there, tucked neatly among them, was an unsigned copy of a will. In it, she named me as the person she wanted to manage the cottages, with explicit instructions to keep rents affordable and prioritize long-term tenants. It was everything I knew in my bones she would want. But there was one problem. Without her signature, it was a roadmap, not a legal document. A story, not yet evidence. I sat in the tiny bank viewing room with those papers spread out like a jigsaw puzzle, feeling grief, anger, and something like resolve all twist together inside my chest. Someone stood between my grandmother's intentions and reality. Someone had either stopped her from signing the final document or made sure that signed version disappeared. Either way, my parents' certainty in that dining room suddenly looked less like confidence and more like strategy. That night, in my grandmother's old kitchen, the citrus cleaner smell still clinging to the counters, I ran my fingers over the unsigned will and the note that had led me there. I thought of her words about taking care of the houses so they could take care of me. I thought of the way my parents had shut me out with surgical precision. I thought of the tenants who had hugged me and the church ladies who cried. I realized I was standing at a crossroads. I could accept their version of events, let the cottages be carved up, sold off, turned into someone else's investment portfolio. Or I could do what my grandmother had always quietly expected of me, follow the trail, find the truth, and protect the legacy she had built nail by nail, year after year. I picked up the phone, took a slow breath, and started making calls. I didn't know yet how ugly things would get, or how deep the lies would run. I just knew one thing with absolute clarity as the Keys night hummed outside the window and the old refrigerator buzzed behind me. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The morning after I found the unsigned will, I woke with a sense of purpose that cut clean through the fog of grief. It wasn't anger, not yet, but something steadier, like the slow tightening of a knot you didn't realize had been loose. My grandmother had left breadcrumbs. My parents had slammed every door in my face. Somewhere between those two facts was the truth, and I was done pretending not to see the shape of it forming in front of me. The Florida Keys sun was already climbing when I pulled into the gravel lot beside the cottages. The air shimmered above the asphalt, thick with heat and the faint tang of salt. The pastel houses stood quiet in the morning stillness, their tin roofs catching the early light. I had walked this path 100 times as a child, carrying paintbrushes or bags of mulch, my grandmother's hand firmly around my wrist as she told me stories about every tenant who'd ever stayed there. Today the place felt different. Not home, not yet, but like a puzzle waiting to be solved. As I approached Cottage 4, the newly installed AC unit caught my eye. The sticker was fresh, the metal gleaming. My parents had mentioned paying for maintenance when insisting they deserved the homes, but none of this matched the ledgers I'd seen in the safe deposit box. I crouched, studying the unit, tracing the serial number with my finger. It felt like a piece of a story they had tried to overwrite. Lieutenant Monroe. The voice came from the porch of Cottage 3. Frank, the retired Coast Guard tenant, lifted a hand. He always greeted me by rank, not out of formality, but respect. I walked toward him, grateful for the steadiness in his presence. "You holding up?" he asked, eyes narrowing slightly as he took in my expression. "I'm trying," I said. "There's just a lot I didn't know." He nodded gently, as if he'd been waiting for me to say that. "Your grandmother trusted you," he said. "More than you think. She didn't trust your parents with these places. Said they understood money, not people." The words landed like a pebble dropped into a pond. Small, but the ripples spread everywhere. "Frank," I asked carefully, "did she ever mention finishing a will?" He hesitated, a brief flicker of hesitation crossing his weathered face. "She told me she met with someone to make things official, said it was a relief." That word again, official. My grandmother had used it. The church ladies had used it. Now Frank. Yet the only will I had found was unsigned. Something didn't add up, and the truth felt close enough to touch. I thanked him and continued walking down the path. As I turned the corner toward Cottage 7, I froze. My father's truck was parked beside it, and he stood talking to a man in a crisp polo shirt holding a clipboard. The man's posture, the glossy pamphlets tucked under his arm, everything about him screamed real estate agent. My father noticed me first. The way he stiffened told me everything I needed to know. The agent glanced over his shoulder, offered me a polite nod, then hurried toward his car, clearly sensing tension thick enough to cut. My father wiped non-existent dust from his hands, a tell I knew too well. "What was that?" I asked. "None of your business," he said. "We're evaluating options." "Options for what?" "The future." I stared at him. "You're trying to sell the cottages." He didn't deny it. "They're ours. We can do what we want." Something inside me snapped. Not anger, not rage, just a clean break of disbelief. "You're acting like she didn't exist," I said quietly. For a moment his eyes softened, just for a breath. She didn't understand how much responsibility these places are. She didn't know what she was asking for. Yes, I said. She did. She trusted me with them. He scoffed. She spoiled you, that's why. There was no point arguing. The man standing in front of me wasn't the father I grew up with. He was someone cornered, desperate, clinging to control with both hands. He turned to leave, but paused halfway to his truck. Drop the hearing, Cassidy. This is embarrassing. I watched the dust kick up behind his tires as he drove off. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't chase after him. I simply pulled out my phone and called the one person who might help me make sense of the chaos. Andrea Wallace, a state attorney. Sharp, experienced, known for having the patience of a nun and the instincts of a bloodhound. This isn't just family drama, she said, after I explained everything, her voice tightening. They're preparing to liquidate assets they may not legally own. We need to act fast. But without a signed will? I asked. You don't need a will, Andrea said. You need proof that one existed and someone tampered with it. The idea sat heavy in my chest. Tampered. Destroyed. Hidden. Words that didn't fit my parents easily, yet here they were, forming themselves in the space between everything I'd seen and everything I knew. Later that week, I walked into the church where my grandmother had spent so much of her time. The pastor welcomed me with a gentleness that cracked something inside me. He led me into his office, rummaged through a locked drawer, and placed a sealed envelope on the desk. She wanted you to have this, he said, in case someone tried to rewrite her story. Inside were a partially signed earlier will, a notarized letter of intent, and most chilling of all, a photocopy of a notary log entry referencing the signing of a final will. My grandmother hadn't forgotten. She hadn't lost track. She had finished it. Someone else had made sure it never saw daylight. By the time I left the church, the sun had dipped low over the water, painting the sky in bruised purples and molten orange. I clutched the envelope to my chest, heart pounding, because I knew this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. The next morning, I knocked on the door of the retired notary, Samuel Rohr, an elderly man with bright eyes and a cane. He didn't hesitate when I asked. She signed it right at her kitchen table, he said. 2 witnesses. I stamped it myself. He handed me his old logbook, open to the page with her name, date, time, and witnesses. It was the missing piece. Proof the will existed. Proof she signed it. Proof someone removed it. My parents weren't just keeping me from the cottage. They were erasing her. And now I finally had a trail strong enough to pull the truth into daylight. The days that followed were a blur of headlights on dark roads, lukewarm coffee, and stacks of paperwork that spread across my grandmother's old dining table like a battlefield map. Each document, each affidavit, each witness statement was a piece of the truth my parents had tried to bury, and with every step forward, the weight on my chest shifted, not lighter exactly, but sharper, focused, purposeful. Andrea worked with the precision of a surgeon. We need everything airtight, she kept reminding me. Not emotional, not personal, just facts. But facts were personal. Every signature proved my grandmother had trusted me. Every timestamp proved she had tried to protect her cottages. Every inconsistency in my parents' timeline dug deeper into a wound I hadn't realized was still bleeding. The notary, Samuel Rohr, signed his affidavit with trembling hands but fierce eyes. She knew someone would make this difficult, he told me, but she said you'd find your way. The 2 neighbors who witnessed the will remembered my grandmother clearly, her careful handwriting, her relief when she'd finally signed the final draft, the way she'd joked that she could die peacefully now, knowing the cottages were safe. The pastor wrote a detailed letter describing her instructions to safeguard her story in case her children tried to rewrite it. Reading that line felt like being punched in the ribs. My grandmother had known. She had seen something in them that I had refused to see. By the end of the week, Andrea's folder was thick enough to slap when she closed it. This is more than enough to challenge their claim, she said, and enough to raise suspicion of will destruction. She didn't say criminal fraud outright, but the word hovered between us anyway like a thundercloud. Meanwhile, my parents continued acting like the cottages were theirs alone. I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt. I truly did. But every time I drove by, I saw my father giving orders to handymen or meeting with people who looked uncomfortably like potential buyers. My mother walked the grounds with the air of a woman inspecting her latest purchase. Then there was Kyle. One evening, as I was locking up Cottage 3, a pair of headlights swung into the gravel lot, blinding me. My brother stepped out of his truck before the engine even cut off. His stance was rigid, jaw clenched, eyes glassy, anger simmering hot enough to scorch. "What are you doing, Cassidy?" he demanded. "I'm trying to protect what Grandma wanted," I said, keeping my voice steady, even though my heart thudded against my ribs. "You're ruining everything," he snapped. "You think you're better than us because you have a uniform, because you got out? This isn't about that." "Yes, it is," he shouted, pointing at me like I was the cause of every bad decision he'd ever made. "You think you're perfect? You think Grandma loved you more? She only picked you because you were her little project." The words shouldn't have hurt. They shouldn't have found the soft, unarmored places inside me. But they did. I swallowed hard. "Kyle, what's going on with you?" He laughed without humor. "You don't get to ask that. You don't get to show up now and act like you're the savior." His voice cracked on the last word. Then, without another glance, he slammed the truck door and sped off, spraying gravel behind him. I stood alone under the street lamp, the Keys night thick and humid around me. For the first time since this started, sadness hit harder than anger. Kyle wasn't just angry, he was lost. And my parents? Their desperation was starting to look less like greed and more like fear. But family pain didn't change the truth. And the truth was solid, unshakable, printed clearly in the affidavits now stacked in Andrea's folder. 2 days later, the hearing notice arrived in the mail. We reviewed everything once more at her office. "Be ready for them to fight dirty," Andrea warned. "Families often do when they feel their power slipping." "I'm Navy," I said. "I'm prepared." But nothing. Not deployments, not storms at sea, not the discipline drilled into me over years, prepared me for the sight of my parents sitting smugly in that courtroom. When I arrived, the air conditioning hummed over polished floors. The room smelled like old wood and tension. My father sat in the front row with one arm stretched along the bench, looking as if he were waiting for a performance he'd already predicted the ending of. My mother sat beside him, smoothing her skirt over and over, her expression carefully blank. Kyle was against the back wall, arms crossed, foot tapping anxiously. Andrea leaned toward me. "Remember, do not react. Let their behavior speak for itself." The judge entered moments later, a seasoned man with silver hair and clear blue eyes that held the weight of too many family battles. We all stood, then sat, then it began. My father spoke first, as if he'd been rehearsing for weeks. "Your Honor, the 7 properties legally transferred to my wife and me. There is no will. Our daughter is simply stirring up trouble." No shame, no hesitation, just certainty. Then the judge turned to me. "Ms. Monroe, you submitted an envelope before the hearing. Step forward." My heartbeat hammered in my ears, but my steps were steady. Navy training, Grandma's voice, purpose. I handed the judge the letter, the packet Andrea and I had assembled with every piece of proof, every statement, every page of my grandmother's truth. The courtroom fell silent as he opened it. He read the notarized logbook entry. He read the pastor's statement. He read the witnesses' affidavits. He flipped through the ledgers and earlier wills, and then he stopped. His eyebrows lifted. He read the page again, then once more. And he laughed, a small surprise laugh that cut through the entire room. My parents blanched. Kyle froze. Andrea exhaled with something like triumph. "Well," the judge said quietly, "this is interesting." He looked at my parents. There was a legally signed will. Its disappearance is extremely concerning. My father's confidence crumbled. My mother gripped the bench, eyes wide. The judge continued, voice firm. "I am ordering an immediate halt to all sales, transfers, or modifications of the properties. Temporary managerial authority goes to Ms. Monroe until further proceedings." My mother gasped. "She's lying." "Enough," the judge snapped. "Speak through counsel." When he finally stood, gavel in hand, he delivered one last blow. "I have seen many family disputes, but this, attempting to override a signed will, is unacceptable. Mediation is strongly advised." He struck the gavel. Court adjourned. I felt something break loose inside me. Not victory, not revenge. Clarity. As we stepped into the Florida sunlight outside the courthouse, Andrea touched my arm gently. "That was a turning point," she said. Maybe it was. But the cost was only beginning to show. Mediation was scheduled 2 days later in a building so plain and beige it looked like it had been designed by someone allergic to emotion. A long wooden table stretched across the center of the room. A carafe of untouched coffee sat sweating in the middle, and the walls were decorated with generic framed photos of beaches that somehow made the place feel even more sterile. It struck me as oddly fitting. After all the storms, secrets, and courtroom tension, The real unraveling of my family was about to take place in a room that smelled faintly of old carpet and printer toner. My parents arrived before I did. Dad sat rigidly at the far end of the table, his tie perfectly straight, his expression carved into that familiar combination of pride and denial. Mom avoided looking at me completely, her gaze fixed instead on a crooked beach painting on the wall, her hands twisted nervously in her lap. Kyle didn't come at all, which wasn't surprising. He had been unraveling since the judge exposed the truth. Andrea placed our folder in front of us with quiet confidence. Across from us, my parents' attorney, an exhausted-looking man with thinning hair, shuffled his papers. The mediator, a calm woman in her 50s with soft eyes and the soothing voice of someone who had seen every kind of family fracture imaginable, opened the session. We're here today to discuss a path forward regarding the disputed properties of the late Rosalind Monroe. My father's composure cracked almost immediately. "This is unnecessary," he snapped. "We didn't destroy anything. That notary must be confused." "3 affidavits, 3 matching signatures, and a notarized log entry," Andrea replied coldly. "All of which align with the exact date your wife filed her inheritance claim." My mother winced at that. A small sound, half breath, half sob, escaped her before she swallowed it down. The mediator raised a hand. "Let's keep this civil." But civil wasn't what any of us truly felt. Dad leaned forward, his voice low and aggrieved. "Those cottages were meant for the family." "They were," I said softly. "For the whole family. Managed responsibly. Preserved. Not sold off." Mom's voice finally broke through, thin and trembling. "We needed the money, Cassidy." I blinked. "Money? You never said—" Dad snapped. "It wasn't your concern." But the dam had already cracked. Mom exhaled shakily, her shoulders sagging as if she had been holding her breath for months. "Your father retired early," she whispered. "Kyle needed loans. We got behind. The cottages, they looked like the only solution." My father closed his eyes as if the admission hurt him deeply. "We were drowning," he muttered. "And you were always gone. Deployments, bases, overseas assignments. We didn't want to burden you." The irony cut straight through me. They had shut me out to protect me, and in doing so, had created the very war they feared. The mediator turned to me gently. "Cassidy, how would you like to respond?" For a long moment, I didn't speak. I just watched my parents, the fear in my mother's shoulders, the exhaustion etched into my father's face, the empty chair where my brother should have been. This family had been cracked long before the cottages came into question. The inheritance just forced the cracks into the light. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm. "I want the cottages managed the way Grandma intended. Affordable, cared for, stable. I want any rental income reinvested into maintenance. No sales, no shortcuts." Dad scoffed. "And where does that leave us?" "Not cut out," I said firmly. "Not punished." They both looked up, startled. "I'm offering a compromise. I take full legal control of the cottages, but a portion of the net income, a modest stipend, goes to you." Andrea looked at me, impressed and a little surprised. Mom whispered, You'd do that? After everything?" I nodded. "I'm Navy. I don't turn my back on family, even when they turn theirs on me." Silence filled the room, the kind that rearranges the air. The mediator wrote quickly, her eyes softening. "This is a workable solution." Dad stared down at the table. "What about Kyle?" he asked quietly, pain flickering in his expression. I swallowed. "Kyle isn't my responsibility, but if he wants help, real help, I'll support him getting treatment." There was no anger in Dad's face now, only a father who feared he had failed twice. The mediator finalized the terms. Their attorney seemed relieved this wouldn't devolve into criminal proceedings. Andrea reviewed everything with a precise nod. Then the mediator asked the one question a courtroom never does. "Before we conclude, do any of you want to say something to each other?" My mother turned to me with eyes shining. "We weren't fair to you. I'm so sorry." My father swallowed hard. "I knew your grandmother trusted you. I should have trusted you too." I nodded slowly. "Then start now." It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was the first honest moment we'd shared in years. When we stepped outside, the Florida sun felt warmer than I remembered. Andrea clasped my shoulder. "You handled that better than most people ever could." "I didn't want revenge," I said. "I wanted peace." "And you got it," she replied. Maybe she was right. A few mornings later, I woke in my grandmother's house, now fully under my care, and made coffee in her old Pelican mug. The sunrise spilled gold over the cottages, painting them in colors that looked almost new. Tenants waved as I stepped onto the porch. It felt like purpose. Quiet, steady, earned. Late that afternoon, I found Kyle sitting alone on the edge of the dock, staring out at the water. I sat beside him without a word. After a long silence, he spoke quietly. "I'm checking into a program," he said. "A real one this time." Relief washed through me. "That's good, Kyle." He rubbed his face. "I messed up. I know I don't deserve your help." "You need it," I said softly. "That's enough." He let out a shaky, broken laugh. "You're too good." "No," I said. "Just stubborn, like Grandma." For the first time in a long while, we smiled the same smile. The weeks that followed were gentle. I repaired shutters, pruned hedges, rewrote rental agreements, and breathed life back into the cottages the way my grandmother once did. Neighbors stopped by with pies. Tenants brought me flowers or fresh bread. My parents visited occasionally, quiet, humbled, opening themselves slowly like people relearning how to be a family. One evening, as the sun bled into the ocean in a sweep of pinks and golds, I sat with my grandmother's last letter in my lap. Her looping handwriting whispered warnings and wisdom. Protect them. Be wary of those who want what they did not earn. Under her words, I wrote my own. Forgive when possible. Heal when you can. Lead with integrity. That night, I recorded one final message for the audio channel where I'd been sharing my story. "If you've made it this far," I said softly, "thank you for walking this road with me." My grandmother believed that honor wasn't about medals or titles. It was about choosing truth, even when it hurts, and choosing kindness, even when it costs you. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs a reminder of what family can overcome. I'd be grateful if you stayed with me. We still have so much to learn together. Not every story ends perfectly, but this one ended honestly, and that, I knew deep down, would have made my grandmother proud.